Now, the whole discussion of homosexuality, we tried to frame it, the Bible and homosexuality, we tried to frame it in terms of something that many people argue today on a number of fronts. And that is that Jesus didn't say anything about it. The argument is Jesus didn't address it, therefore it's okay. And last time we quoted a famous former president, Jimmy Carter, who held this view and stated it openly, and this is what he said. He said, homosexuality was well known in the ancient world, well before Christ was born, and Jesus never said a word about homosexuality. So that's kind of been the frame of this discussion. We started the Old Testament. We're moving through that Old Testament. Now we're going into the New Testament, where we're obviously going to get to the teachings of Christ himself, and we want to ask ourselves that question. We want to keep that question in mind. Did Jesus condemn homosexuality? And if so, how? And how do we understand what Jesus said about that? You'll also, by the way, you might see that argument also on abortion. Some people will say, well, Jesus never directly addressed abortion, therefore abortion's okay. Well, we're going to give you the principle today to understand that kind of argument and always to be able to give an answer for it. So we'll come back to this question later on as we wrap up today. So let's then begin with homosexuality and the New Testament. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the Apostle Paul. And we've already talked about Jude. Remember when we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, we jumped over into the New Testament and saw what Jude had to say about that. But now we're going to look at Paul. We're going to look at 3 verses where Paul mentions this specifically. And then we'll look at the teachings of Christ himself and see what he has to say about it. So we're going to look at 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 10, which Brother Todd read to us this morning. We'll look at 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11. And then we'll look at Romans chapter 1, 24 through 28, right? So let's look at these then, beginning with 1 Timothy. What does Paul teach us there about homosexuality? These are the verses, and this is what they say. Paul writes, "The law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for murderers, for fornicators, for sodomites, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine." So Paul is teaching us here that one of the functions of the law of God is to restrain the evil of wicked people. And so when you preach and teach the law to people, it restrains, it kind of creates boundaries for their activity. And he lays out some specific types of people. He gives examples. This is not an entire list, it's just examples. He says the law is made for the lawless and insubordinate. That's just a broad category. And then he goes for ungodly people, for sinners. We're getting a little more narrow. For murderers, for fornicators, for sodomites. And if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine. So he's saying, look, the law helps restrain evil. This is why we must always be preaching the laws of God, the commands of God, because we become that element that influences a society and keeps them from doing all the wicked they would otherwise do. But in our study today, we're going to look at a lot of Greek words. We're going to look at some Greek words to understand what exactly the Bible is saying in these verses from Paul and these verses from Jesus. But you might ask, why? Why would we look at Greek words? Why do preachers talk about Greek words when we're reading an English Bible? You know, why are we talking about Greek words? Well, as you might know, the New Testament, all the Gospels and Paul's writings all the way to Revelation, was written originally in a language called Greek. And so we have them translated from Greek into English. But what happens sometimes is you lose some of the nuances of the meaning of those Greek words when you translate. That doesn't mean the English Bibles can't be trusted. It just means that God gives us, He has preserved those early Greek copies that we can go back and look at Greek words to see what did that word mean to them in that time. And that helps us understand more of what the English words mean. So this is what, you'll be surprised to know, this is what the words of Paul when he wrote this actually looked like on the paper or the papyrus that he wrote. That's Greek right there. If you go look it up on the internet and you look up a Greek New Testament, you're going to see that these are the words that were actually used. So we're going to go in now and we're going to look at these. I just want you to see this so you can kind of get a sense of what's behind the Bible. But we want to look at 2 words that are in this verse that address the issue of homosexuality. All right? And those two words are fornicators and sodomites. Fornicators and sodomites. What do these English words really mean deep down in the Greek? So let's look at that. So, fornicators. That word is the Greek word pornos. Now, what I've asked Asa to do is I'm going to share with you a minute some sites that you can go to and help you learn the words yourself or be able to look them up. I don't know Greek. I don't know that Ollie knows Greek or James might know some Greek. I don't know. But we have to look these things up. This is how we find them. But what I've asked Asa to do is there's a website where it will play the pronunciation of the word for you. So I want you to hear how this would be stated in actual Greek. So play this for us, Asa.
Pornos.
Play it again.
Pornos.
Pornos. So this Greek word here for fornicator is the word pornos. And pornos means a male prostitute. A man who indulges in unlawful sex and what we call a fornicator. And so the word has a narrow meaning. It applies to something very specific. And then over time it grew to cover a larger piece of human behavior, sexual behavior. So the first definition is a male prostitute. And so we have those today. We have men who sell their bodies for sex. Well, in the Greek culture, in the Roman culture, this was particularly bad in idol worship. They would have male prostitutes, and when you would go to an idolatrous temple, you could have sex with a male prostitute, and that was your way of worshiping. Really sick, isn't it? All right, but we still have that today. I know a lot of men who end up in prostitution, especially homosexual prostitution, get there through drug addiction. I've had men who were drug addicts say, "You would not believe the things that I would do to get money for my drug habit." And many of that was homosexual in nature. But so we have a narrow definition, male prostitute, okay, clearly dealing with homosexuality. And then any man, any person who does any sex outside of God's design. So my students here, my young people, remember this bubble. There's a bubble. There's the marriage bubble. And inside that, there's one man and there's one woman who have combined themselves into a covenant under God to be faithful to one another for their lives. Anything outside of that, if you have your friends at school sleeping with their boyfriends, right? That's unlawful. That is wicked. That is not part of God's design. We have people living together. That's fornication. Why? Because these are people who are not married, who are having sex all the time. This is not God's design. So fornication is the word that we use, a fornicator, and that's what he's talking about there. So then we have this other word. By the way, we'll come back to pornos later when we talk about Jesus. Pornos is a key word. It's an umbrella term also for all types of sexual sin. Anything, homosexual or otherwise, pornos can apply to that. Any kind of sex outside of God's design. So let's go on now and let's look at the word for sodomite. And in the English, you can easily see where this word came from. What did we talk about in Genesis 19 when God destroyed the cities? What were those cities? Come on, you can say it. Sodom and Gomorrah. So a sodomite in English was a homosexual, a sodomite. But let's look at the Greek word here. This is the Greek word, arsenokoitos. I think I got that pretty close. We're going to have Asa play this word for us a couple of times. Arsenokoitos, I think I got close. See how close I got. Come on.
Arsenokoitos.
Arsenokoitos. Say it again.
Arsenokoitos.
Arsenokoitos. All right. Arsenokoitos means one who lies with a male as with a female. A sodomite, a homosexual. So what Paul is saying here is when he's talking about these types of lawless people, lawless meaning outside of God's law. Who cares about God's law? We do whatever we want to do whenever we want to do it. He names two classes of people that fall into that. One is pornos, male prostitutes and people who just have sex however they want to. And then he specifically calls out a man who lies with a man as he does with a female. That means a man who is having sex with another man. These people are outside of God's law, and God's law is supposed to be preached to keep them from going so far in their sin and apostasy.